The gunshot that split the afternoon air wasn't what made Eleanor Brennan drop the water bucket, but the sight of her father collapsing in the dusty street of Dry Creek, Texas, in the sweltering July heat of 1878, sent the wooden pail tumbling from her left hand, water splashing across her worn boots. She ran toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs, her left hand already reaching for him before she remembered his last words that morning, the ones he spoke every day like a prayer turned poison. That her left-handedness was a curse from the devil himself, that no good would ever come from a girl who reached for things with the wrong hand, that she'd brought nothing but misfortune to their family since the day she was born. The town doctor, old Samuel Pritchard, was already kneeling beside her father when Eleanor pushed through the gathering crowd, her dark hair coming loose from its braid, her green eyes wild with fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. Her father's eyes were closed, his weathered face pale beneath years of sun damage, and there was blood, so much blood, spreading across his chest from where the stray bullet from the saloon fight had found him. She dropped to her knees beside him, her left hand hovering over his body, uncertain where to touch, how to help, and then his eyes fluttered open. "Don't touch me with that hand," he wheezed, blood flecking his lips. "Don't curse me further." Even dying, he couldn't let it go. Eleanor pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned, cradling it against her chest while her right hand, clumsy and uncertain, reached for his instead. The doctor worked quickly, but Eleanor could see in his eyes that it was too late. Her father had maybe minutes, and he was spending them the way he'd spent the last 22 years, reminding her that she was wrong, broken, cursed. "Eleanor," her father gasped, gripping her right hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll find a way to break it. Find a preacher, find someone who can fix you. That hand has haunted this family long enough." She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that her left hand had never hurt anyone, that it was just a hand, that the real curse was the way he'd looked at her every day of her life like she was something twisted and evil. But he was dying in the street, and she was his only child, and despite everything, she loved him in that complicated way children love their parents even when those parents have spent years cutting them down. "I promise," she lied, because what else could she say? He died 30 seconds later, his last breath a rattle that Eleanor would hear in her nightmares for weeks to come. The crowd dispersed slowly, offering condolences that felt hollow, and Eleanor sat in the dust beside her father's body, her left hand pressed flat against the ground, feeling the heat of the Texas earth seep into her palm. She'd been born in this town, raised in the small house on the edge of the settlement where her father had tried and failed to make a living as a saddle maker, where her mother had died of fever when Eleanor was just 7, where every person knew that Marcus Brennan's daughter was touched by darkness because she favored her left hand. The funeral was 2 days later, a simple affair in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Dry Creek. Eleanor stood alone at the grave, wearing her only black dress, watching as they lowered her father into the ground. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, gave a sermon about God's mercy and the mysteries of his plan, but he kept glancing at Eleanor's left hand as if expecting it to do something unholy right there among the crosses and tombstones. After everyone left, Eleanor remained staring at the fresh-turned earth. She had $63 to her name, the small amount her father had saved, and a house that was more holes than walls. She had no other family, no prospects, and a reputation in Dry Creek that preceded her like a shadow. She was the cursed girl, the left-handed devil child, the one mothers warned their sons about when they thought she couldn't hear. She was also alone for the first time in her life, and that thought was more terrifying than any curse. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn. A man on a dust-covered bay horse was riding up the cemetery path, his hat pulled low against the late afternoon sun. Eleanor tensed, her left hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept at her belt, a habit her father had hated but never managed to break her of. The man dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle, and when he removed his hat, Eleanor saw a face that was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, with eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. "Who's asking?" Eleanor kept her distance, kept her hand near the knife. "Name's James Cordell. I was a friend of your father's years back." He turned the hat in his hands, a gesture that seemed almost nervous. "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry for your loss." Eleanor studied him, trying to place the name, the face. Her father had never mentioned a James Cordell, but then again, her father had spent most of his time telling her what was wrong with her rather than talking about his own life. "I don't recall him mentioning you. It was a long time ago. We worked together on a ranch up near Abilene before you were born." James took a step closer, and Eleanor noticed the way he moved, careful and deliberate, like a man used to dangerous situations. "I was passing through, heard about Marcus, thought I should pay my respects. You've paid them." "Anything else?" Eleanor didn't mean to sound harsh, but exhaustion and grief had worn away her ability to be polite. James looked at her for a long moment, those storm-colored eyes seeming to see more than she wanted to show. "I heard you're alone now, no family. News travels fast." Eleanor crossed her arms, suddenly very aware of how isolated they were up here on the hill, how the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. "What's it to you? I've got a proposition, if you're willing to hear it." James put his hat back on, adjusting it against the glare. "I'm heading west, got a ranch out in New Mexico territory near a town called Silver Springs. It's good land, good water, but I need help running it. I need someone who can cook, keep books, help with the horses. It's hard work, but it's honest and the pay is fair. Room and board included." Eleanor stared at him, trying to understand the angle. Men didn't just offer jobs to strange women, not without expecting something in return. "What's the catch?" "No catch. You'd have your own quarters in the house, separate from mine." "I'm not looking for anything improper, if that's what you're worried about. I just need reliable help, and I figure you could use a fresh start somewhere people don't know you." He paused, then added, "Somewhere you could be whoever you want to be." It was the last part that got her, that tiny flicker of possibility. A place where no one knew about the curse, where she could use her left hand without seeing fear and disgust in people's eyes. But she'd learned young that things that seemed too good were usually traps in disguise. "Why me?" "You don't know anything about me. I know you're Marcus Brennan's daughter, and Marcus was one of the hardest workers I ever met. I figure some of that runs in the family." James's expression didn't change, but something in his voice softened slightly. "And I know what it's like to need an escape." Eleanor looked back at her father's grave, at the small wooden cross that would weather and fade until no one remembered who was buried there. She thought about the house waiting for her down the hill, empty and full of ghosts. She thought about spending the rest of her life in Dry Creek, watching people cross the street to avoid her, dying alone and unmourned like her father. "When do we leave?" she heard herself say. "Dawn. Meet me at the edge of town, near the old Miller barn. Bring whatever you can carry." James mounted his horse in one smooth motion. "And Miss Brennan? Whatever your father told you about yourself, whatever this town thinks they know, you leave that here in the dirt. Where we're going, you get to start clean." He rode away before Eleanor could respond, leaving her standing among the graves with her heart beating fast and her left hand tingling like it knew something was about to change. She spent that night packing her few belongings into a canvas bag, taking only what mattered. Her mother's wedding ring, 2 changes of clothes, her father's leather-bound Bible even though she hadn't opened it in years, and the small wooden horse her father had carved for her when she was 5, before he'd decided she was cursed. The house felt smaller in the lamplight, shabbier, and Eleanor felt no sadness at leaving it behind. She'd never been happy here, never felt like she belonged. At dawn, she walked through the quiet streets of Dry Creek for the last time, her bag slung over her left shoulder, her head high despite the exhaustion dragging at her bones. James Cordell was waiting by the Miller barn as promised, along with a sturdy-looking sorrel mare saddled and ready. "You ride?" he asked as she approached. "Well enough." Eleanor had learned young, though her father had constantly criticized the way she held the reins in her left hand. This is Rosie. She's gentle, patient, good for long distances. James helped her secure her bag to the saddle, his movements efficient and impersonal. It's about a week's ride to Silver Springs, maybe more if the weather turns. We'll camp rough most nights, stay in towns when we can. You comfortable with that? I'm comfortable with leaving. Eleanor mounted Rosie, settling into the saddle with an ease that surprised her. It had been months since she'd ridden, but her body remembered. They rode out of Dry Creek as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Eleanor didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the horizon, on the promise of somewhere new. James set a steady pace, not too fast but not dawdling either, and they rode in silence for the first few hours, the only sounds the steady clip of hooves and the occasional call of a bird. It wasn't until they stopped to water the horses at a creek around midday that James spoke again. "You know anything about ranching?" "Some. My father kept horses for a while when I was young before he gave it up." Eleanor knelt by the creek, cupping water in both hands to drink, not thinking about which hand she used until she saw James watching. She froze, waiting for the familiar look of disgust or fear. Instead, he just said, "You're left-handed." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes. My brother was left-handed. Best shot I ever saw, could rope a calf faster than anyone on the ranch." James filled his canteen, his expression neutral. "Never seemed like a curse to me." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Most people don't see it that way. "Most people are fools." James stood, offering her his hand to help her up. Without thinking, Eleanor reached out with her left hand, and James took it without hesitation, pulling her to her feet. His hand was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not crushing, and when he let go, Eleanor found herself staring at her own hand like it belonged to someone else. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not flinching." James's expression shifted, something that might have been understanding or sympathy crossing his weathered face. "Like I said, you leave that old story behind. Out here, all that matters is whether you can do the work and keep your word. The rest is just noise." They rode on, and as the day wore into evening, Eleanor found herself relaxing in small increments. James wasn't much for conversation, but when he did speak, it was about practical things. The best way to read the weather, which plants were safe to eat, how to tell if a water source was good or tainted. He treated her like a partner, not like something fragile or cursed, and that simple respect was more intoxicating than Eleanor wanted to admit. They made camp that night in a small clearing off the main trail, and James showed Eleanor how to properly set up a bedroll to avoid snakes and scorpions. He cooked beans and salt pork over a small fire, and they ate in comfortable silence while the stars came out overhead. More stars than Eleanor had ever seen, bright and infinite against the black sky. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. "Wait until we get further west." The sky gets even bigger. James poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks. "You ever been outside Texas? Never been outside Dry Creek?" Eleanor wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the flames. "My father didn't like to travel. Said there was no point running from a curse, it would just follow." "Your father was wrong about a lot of things." James's voice was gentle but firm. "You're not cursed, Eleanor. You're just different, and different scares people who don't understand it." Eleanor looked at him across the fire, this stranger who was being kinder to her than her own father had ever been. "Why are you doing this? Really?" James was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Then he sighed, setting down his stick. "I told you my brother was left-handed. His name was Thomas. He died 5 years ago, shot by a man who thought Thomas was cheating at cards because he dealt with his left hand. Said it was unnatural, devil's work." James's jaw tightened. "I couldn't stop it. I was across the room, and by the time I got there, Thomas was bleeding out on the floor. He died thinking the world hated him for something he couldn't control." "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered. "Me too, every day." James looked up at the stars. When I heard about your father, about what people in Dry Creek said about you, I don't know. I thought maybe I could do for you what I couldn't do for Thomas. Give you a chance to live somewhere you don't have to hide." Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes, the first real tears she'd cried since her father died. "That's the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've seen the ranch. It's rough living and the work is hard." But James was smiling slightly, just a quirk at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her left hand, a deliberate gesture. "I'm afraid of staying in one place until I turn into my father, bitter and afraid of everything." "Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen." James stood, stretching. "Get some sleep. We've got a long day tomorrow." Eleanor lay in her bedroll, staring up at those impossible stars, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope. The next several days fell into a rhythm. They rode from dawn until late afternoon, stopped to rest the horses and themselves, then made camp as the sun set. James taught her things along the way: how to track animals by their prints, how to start a fire with damp wood, how to tell direction by the sun and stars. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing, never showed impatience when she struggled with something. And he never, not once, commented on her left-handedness, except to occasionally point out that she had a natural advantage with certain tasks because of it. Eleanor found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying the way he moved with such unconscious grace, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for danger. He was probably in his early 30s, she guessed, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work. There was a sadness in him, a weight he carried, but also a fundamental decency that shone through in small gestures. The way he always made sure she had enough food before he ate, the way he positioned his bedroll between her and the trail at night, a silent protection. On the fourth day, they rode through a small town called Redemption, and James insisted on getting them a room at the boarding house so Eleanor could have a proper bath and a real bed. The landlady, Mrs. Chen, was a tiny Chinese woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, and she showed Eleanor to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Your husband is a good man," Mrs. Chen said as she brought up hot water for the bath. "You are lucky." "He's not my husband," Eleanor said quickly. "He's my employer." Mrs. Chen gave her a look that suggested she'd heard that story before and didn't believe it for a second, but she just said, "Dinner is at 6. Don't be late." Eleanor sank into the hot bath with a groan of pure relief, feeling days of trail dust and sweat finally wash away. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, washed her hair 3 times, and when she finally climbed out and dried off, she felt more human than she had in weeks. She put on her cleanest dress, a simple calico in faded blue, and braided her hair while it was still damp. When she came down to dinner, James was already at the table, cleaned up himself, his hair still wet and slicked back. He stood when she entered, a gesture of old-fashioned manners that made Eleanor's cheeks warm, and pulled out her chair. "You look nice," he said simply. "So do you." Eleanor sat, intensely aware of how domestic this felt, how much it looked like they were a real couple sharing a meal. The other guests at the boarding house clearly thought so, judging by the smiles and nods they received. Mrs. Chen served roast chicken and vegetables, and it was the best meal Eleanor had eaten in months, maybe years. She ate with her left hand, using her fork the way that felt natural to her, and when she realized what she was doing, she glanced up to find James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing, just good to see you comfortable." He cut into his chicken. "You've been tensing up whenever we pass people on the trail, like you're expecting them to say something." Eleanor hadn't realized he'd noticed. "Old habits. We'll work on new ones." James's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "By the time we reach Silver Springs, you'll be so used to being yourself that you won't even think about it anymore." "Is that a promise?" Eleanor surprised herself with the playful tone. "It's a guarantee." James smiled, a real smile that lit up his whole face and made him look years younger, and Eleanor felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. After dinner, they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the town settle into evening. James smoked a cigarette and Eleanor rocked slowly in one of Mrs. Chen's rocking chairs, feeling full and clean and strangely content. "Tell me about Silver Springs," she said. "What's it like?" "Small. Maybe 300 people, mostly ranchers and miners. There's a general store, a saloon, a church. Good people for the most part." James blew smoke into the twilight. "The ranch is about 5 miles outside town, up against the foothills. I've got about 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses. The house is nothing fancy, but it's solid. Built it myself 3 years ago. You've been there alone all that time?" "Mostly. I had a hired hand for a while, but he moved on last spring. It's been just me since then, and I'm not getting any younger. Started to feel like maybe it was time to have another person around." James glanced at her. "I'm not always great company. I can go days without talking when I'm working, but I'm not cruel and I don't drink to excess, and I'll always deal with you honestly. That's the best I can promise." "That's more than most men promise." Eleanor met his eyes. "I'll work hard for you, James. I'll earn my keep." "I know you will." He stubbed out his cigarette. "We should get some rest. 3 more days to Silver Springs if the weather holds." Eleanor lay in the real bed that night, feeling the softness of the mattress after days on the hard ground, and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 2 weeks ago, she'd been trapped in Dry Creek with a dying father and no future. Now she was riding west with a man she barely knew, toward a life she couldn't quite imagine. It should have been terrifying, and part of it was, but mostly she just felt alive in a way she never had before. They left Redemption at dawn, and the landscape began to change as they rode west. The flat plains of Texas gave way to rolling hills, and then to red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. The air grew drier, the heat more intense, and Eleanor was grateful for the canteen James had filled at every opportunity. On the 6th day, they encountered their first real trouble. They were riding through a narrow canyon when James suddenly held up a hand, signaling Eleanor to stop. She reined in Rosie, her heart immediately starting to pound, and followed James's gaze to where 3 men on horses blocked the trail ahead. "Afternoon," one of the men called out. He was big, with a thick beard and mean eyes. "That's some nice horses you got there. They're not for sale." James's voice was calm, but Eleanor saw his hand drift toward the revolver at his hip. "We're just passing through, no trouble wanted." "Well, see, that's the thing." The bearded man walked his horse closer. "We've got a toll on this canyon, call it a fee for safe passage." "I don't recall seeing any signs about a toll." James shifted in his saddle, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor. "It's a new policy." One of the other men, a thin fellow with a scar across his cheek, grinned unpleasantly. $20 each. Eleanor's stomach dropped. $40 was more than half of everything she owned. She saw James's jaw tighten, saw him calculating the odds. 3 against 1 in a narrow space where there was no room to run, and he had her to protect, which limited his options. "That's highway robbery," James said flatly. "Call it what you want." The bearded man's hand moved to his own gun. "Pay up or we'll take the horses and whatever else you got." Eleanor's mind raced. She'd heard stories about trail bandits, about what they did to travelers who couldn't pay, especially women. Her left hand moved to the knife at her belt, the small blade her father had never known she could throw with deadly accuracy, a skill she'd learned in secret from an old Mexican ranch hand when she was 12. "We'll pay," James said, reaching slowly for his saddlebag. "Just stay calm." But Eleanor saw the look in the bearded man's eyes, saw the way the other 2 were spreading out to flank them, and she knew they weren't going to stop at $40. These men meant to rob them of everything and probably worse. Her father's voice echoed in her head, cursed, evil, devil's work. Maybe he was right. Maybe her left hand was cursed. Maybe it was time to use that curse for something good. The knife was out of its sheath and flying through the air before she consciously decided to throw it. It caught the bearded man in his gun arm, the blade sinking deep into muscle and making him scream and drop his weapon. In the same instant, James drew his revolver and fired, the shot deafeningly loud in the confined space of the canyon. One of the other bandits fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder, and the third man wheeled his horse around and took off at a gallop, clearly wanting no part of a fight that had turned against them so quickly. The bearded man was cursing, trying to pull the knife from his arm with his other hand, and James kept his gun trained on him. "Get out of here," James said, his voice cold as winter. "And count yourself lucky we let you live. Tell your friend the same when he's done bleeding." The bearded man managed to yank the knife free, tossed it on the ground, and spurred his horse past them, the wounded man following close behind. Eleanor and James sat frozen for a moment, waiting to make sure they were really gone, and then James turned to look at Eleanor with an expression of pure astonishment. "Where in the hell did you learn to throw like that?" Eleanor's hands were shaking as she dismounted to retrieve her knife. "A ranch hand named Miguel taught me. My father never knew. I used to practice on targets behind the barn." She wiped the blood off on the ground, her stomach churning. "I've never thrown at a person before." James holstered his gun and dismounted as well, coming to stand beside her. "You might have just saved our lives. Those men weren't going to stop at robbery." "I know." Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Is that man going to die, the one you shot?" I aimed for his shoulder. "He'll live if he's smart enough to get it treated." James put a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Hey, look at me." Eleanor raised her eyes to his. "My father was right. I am cursed. I hurt people." "No," James's voice was firm. "You defended yourself and someone who couldn't defend themselves alone. That's not a curse, Eleanor. That's courage, and that throw, that was skill, plain and simple. Skill you earned through practice and talent." He paused. "You used your left hand." "Yes, and it saved us both." James squeezed her shoulder gently. "So much for curses." Eleanor felt something break open inside her. Some dam she'd built years ago to hold back all the anger and pain of being told she was wrong, evil, cursed. Tears poured down her face, great shuddering sobs that she couldn't control, and James pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried. He didn't tell her to stop, didn't tell her to be strong. He just held her, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, and let her grieve for all the years she'd spent hating a part of herself that had just proven to be a gift. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor pulled back, embarrassed and exhausted. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." James brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture achingly tender. "You've been carrying that for too long." They remounted and rode on, but something had shifted between them. Some barrier had come down. Eleanor felt it in the way James kept glancing over at her, making sure she was all right, and in the way her own eyes kept drifting to him, studying the line of his jaw, the way he sat his horse, the competent strength in his hands. That night when they made camp, James asked her to teach him how to throw a knife left-handed. "Figure I should learn," he said with a grin, "since you made it look so easy." Eleanor laughed, the first real laugh she'd had since before her father died, and spent an hour showing James the basics. He was terrible at it, his throws going wide or falling short, but he kept trying, and his good-natured frustration was endearing. "I have newfound respect for your skill," he said after missing the tree they were using as a target for the 10th time. "This is harder than it looks." "Everything worth doing is." Eleanor retrieved the knife and handed it back to him. "Try keeping your wrist looser." James threw again, and this time the knife at least hit the tree, though it bounced off instead of sticking. "Progress," he declared triumphantly, and Eleanor laughed again. Later, sitting by the fire, James said quietly, "I hope you know how remarkable you are." Eleanor looked up from the coffee she was nursing. "What do you mean?" "You've spent your whole life being told you're cursed, that there's something wrong with you, and instead of believing it, you turned that very thing they hated into a skill that saved lives today. That takes a kind of strength most people never develop." James stared into the fire. "My brother believed what people said about him. He thought he was less than others because he was left-handed. I tried to tell him different, but the world was louder than I was. If he'd had half your courage, he might still be alive. Or he might have thrown a knife at the wrong person and gotten hung for it. Eleanor's voice was soft. I was lucky today, James. It could have gone so much worse. But it didn't. And you didn't hesitate when it mattered. That's not luck, that's character. James looked at her across the fire, and in his eyes, Eleanor saw something that made her breath catch. Admiration, yes, but also something warmer, something that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. Thank you, she managed, for everything. For getting me out of Dry Creek, for treating me like a person, for this. She gestured around them at the vast night sky, the open country. You don't need to thank me. This is just you getting what you should have had all along. James stood, stretching. Come on, we should sleep. Tomorrow we cross into New Mexico. You'll see your new home by nightfall the day after. Eleanor lay in her bedroll that night, thinking about James's words, about the way he'd held her while she cried, about the way her heart had started beating faster whenever he smiled at her. She was falling for him, she realized, falling for this sad, kind cowboy who had given her back her life. It was probably foolish, probably dangerous to her heart, but she couldn't seem to stop it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of beautiful, harsh landscape. They crossed into New Mexico territory, and the land opened up in ways that took Eleanor's breath away. Mesas rose in the distance, their flat tops cutting sharp lines against the blue sky, and the earth was every shade of red and orange and gold. They saw a herd of pronghorn antelope in the distance, their white markings bright against the scrubland, and an eagle circling overhead, riding thermals Eleanor couldn't feel. On the evening of the 8th day, as the sun was painting the sky in shades of fire, James pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings was visible in the distance. That's Silver Springs. The ranch is just beyond, up in those foothills. Eleanor's stomach fluttered with nerves and excitement. This was it, the new life she'd been riding toward. Whatever happened next, she was here, far from Dry Creek and her father's grave and the life that had never fit her right. They rode through Silver Springs as dusk was settling in, and Eleanor saw that James had been right about it being small. The main street had maybe a dozen buildings. A general store, a saloon, a small church, a hotel, a blacksmith, a few houses. People looked up as they passed, curious but not unfriendly, and a few waved at James, clearly recognizing him. That's the Mercantile, James pointed out as they rode. Run by a couple named the Johnsons. Good people, fair prices. The doc is in the yellow house there, name's Patterson. The sheriff is Tom Brady, his office is next to the saloon, and that's the church, though the preacher only comes through once a month. They rode on, past the edge of town and up into the foothills, following a well-worn trail. The sun was nearly gone when they crested a rise, and Eleanor saw the ranch spread out below them in the purple twilight. The house was exactly as James had described, solid, simple, built of wood and stone with a wide porch. There was a barn, a corral, a few outbuildings. In the fading light, Eleanor could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the darkening land. Welcome home, James said softly. Home? Eleanor tested the word in her mind and found that it felt right in a way Dry Creek never had. It's perfect. They rode down to the house and James helped her dismount, then showed her where to tie Rosie before he started unloading their gear. The house was unlocked, and when James lit a lamp, Eleanor saw a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, a table and chairs. Everything was neat and well-maintained, though clearly the home of a man living alone. Your room is through here. James led her to a small bedroom off the main room. It had a bed, a dresser, a small window that looked out toward the mountains. It's not much, but the mattress is good and you've got privacy. My room is on the other side of the house. It's wonderful. Eleanor set her bag on the bed, feeling a strange sense of unreality. This was hers, this space, this room. Thank you, James. I'll show you around properly tomorrow, get you situated with your duties and such. Tonight, let's just have a simple supper and rest. It's been a long journey. James lingered in the doorway, and Eleanor thought he might say something else. but he just nodded and left her to settle in. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe, setting her mother's ring on the dresser where she could see it. The wooden horse her father had carved went on the windowsill, a reminder of the rare moments when he'd shown her love instead of disdain. Then she went back out to the main room where James was cooking bacon and beans at the stove. "Can I help?" she asked. "Just sit." "You can start earning your keep tomorrow. Tonight you're still a guest." James dished up 2 plates and brought them to the table. They ate in comfortable silence, and Eleanor realized how much things had changed in just over a week. She no longer felt nervous around James, no longer had to think carefully about every word she said or every movement she made. Around him, she could just be herself, left hand and all. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, catching her staring. "Just that I don't think I've ever felt this comfortable around another person before." Eleanor spoke without thinking, then blushed. "I mean, you've been very kind and I appreciate it." "I like having you here," James said simply. "The house already feels less empty." There was a weight to his words, a meaning beneath them that Eleanor didn't quite dare to examine. Instead, she focused on finishing her meal, and then she helped James clean up despite his protests. When everything was put away, James showed her where the washroom was, filled a basin with water for her, and bid her good night. Eleanor washed and changed into her nightgown, then lay in the small bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. The distant lowing of cattle, the wind through the trees, the creak of the house settling. She felt safe here in a way she'd never felt safe in Dry Creek. She felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in her life. She fell asleep thinking about James's storm-colored eyes and woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the smell of coffee. The next week settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. James woke before dawn every day to tend the cattle and horses, and Eleanor quickly took over the household duties. Cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, keeping the books for the ranch. She discovered she was good at managing the accounts, her neat left-handed script filling the ledgers with records of expenses and income. James never commented on her handwriting except to say it was the clearest he'd ever seen. She also started helping with the horses, a task she took to immediately. There was a bay gelding named Thunder who was skittish and difficult, and Eleanor spent hours working with him, speaking softly, moving slowly, never raising her voice. James watched her one afternoon from across the corral, a look of amazement on his face. "I've been trying to calm that horse for 6 months," he said when Eleanor finally got Thunder to eat an apple from her left hand. "You did it in 2 weeks." "He just needed patience," Eleanor said, stroking Thunder's neck. "Someone hurt him once. He's afraid of being hurt again. I know how that feels." James's expression went soft. "Yeah, I imagine you do." As the days passed, Eleanor found herself falling deeper in love with both the ranch and the man who owned it. James was everything her father hadn't been: patient, kind, respectful. He treated her as an equal partner in the running of the ranch, asking her opinion on decisions, listening when she had ideas for improvements. He never made her feel stupid or cursed or less than. And he was beautiful to watch when he worked, all lean muscle and competent strength, whether he was breaking a horse or mending a fence or doctoring a sick calf. Eleanor tried not to stare, but it was difficult. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her too, and the heat in his gaze made her skin feel too tight. They went into Silver Springs together every few weeks for supplies, and the townspeople quickly accepted Eleanor as part of James's household. No one asked uncomfortable questions about their arrangement, though Eleanor saw the speculative looks from some of the women. The owner of the mercantile, Mrs. Johnson, was particularly friendly, often slipping an extra piece of candy or ribbon into Eleanor's purchases with a knowing wink. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon," Mrs. Johnson said one day while James was outside loading supplies onto the wagon. Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. "He's my employer. It's not like that, Mrs. Johnson didn't look convinced. "If you say so, dear." But take it from a woman who's been married 30 years. I know what love looks like, and that man is halfway gone over you." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she just thanked Mrs. Johnson and escaped to the wagon where James was checking the load. He smiled when he saw her, that slow smile that lit up his whole face, and Eleanor felt her heart do its now-familiar acrobatics. One evening in late September, after a particularly long day of helping James move the cattle to fresh grazing land, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Eleanor's hands were sore from rope work, her legs tired from hours in the saddle, but she felt good, accomplished. "You're a natural at this," James said, offering her a canteen of water. "I've had hired hands who didn't take to ranch work as fast as you have. I like it. It's hard, but it's honest. I can see the results of what I do." Eleanor drank deeply, then handed back the canteen. "And there's something about working with the land, with the animals. It feels right." "I know what you mean." James was quiet for a moment, then said, "Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy here, really happy, not just making the best of a bad situation?" His eyes were serious, searching her face. "Because if you're not, if you want to go somewhere else, try something different, I'll help you. I don't want you to feel trapped." Eleanor turned to look at him fully, at this good man who had given her everything and was now offering to let her go if she wanted. "James, I'm happier here than I've been in my entire life. I wake up every morning grateful that you found me in that cemetery. I don't feel trapped, I feel free." Something shifted in James's expression, a tension releasing. "Good, that's good, I just wanted to make sure." "Why did you really come to Dry Creek?" Eleanor asked the question that had been nagging at her since that first day, the truth this time. James sighed, looking out at the darkening sky. "I told you about Thomas, about how he died. What I didn't tell you is that after he was gone, I couldn't forgive myself for not protecting him. I threw myself into building this ranch, working until I was too tired to think, but I was lonely. The house felt empty. And then I heard about your father from a traveling merchant who'd passed through Dry Creek. He mentioned Marcus Brennan had a left-handed daughter that everyone thought was cursed, and something in me just knew I had to go, had to see if maybe I could give you what I couldn't give Thomas. So I'm a replacement for your brother." Eleanor tried to keep her voice neutral, but she heard the hurt in it anyway. "No." James turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his, left and right equally. "At first, maybe that's what I told myself, that I was doing a good deed, saving someone like Thomas. But Eleanor, from the moment you agreed to come with me, from the first day on the trail, you haven't been a substitute for anyone. You're yourself, wholly and completely, and somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about Thomas and started thinking about you." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she thought James must be able to hear it. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm in love with you." James's voice was rough, raw with emotion. "I've been in love with you since you threw that knife to save us both, maybe since before that. I've been fighting it because you're young and you work for me, and I didn't want you to feel obligated. But I can't keep pretending I only feel friendship when I look at you." Eleanor stared at him, at his storm-colored eyes full of hope and fear, at the way he held her hands like they were precious, and she felt joy burst through her like sunrise. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I've loved you since you took my left hand without flinching, since you told me I could leave the old stories behind." James let out a shaky breath, and then he was pulling her close, and Eleanor went willingly, wrapping her arms around him and holding on like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. She could feel his heart beating against her chest, could feel his breath in her hair, and it was perfect, exactly right. When he finally pulled back, it was only far enough to frame her face with his hands. "Can I kiss you?" "Please," Eleanor breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper, more urgent. She'd never been kissed before, had never had the opportunity in Dry Creek, but her body seemed to know what to do. She kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her love and gratitude and desire into the press of her mouth against his, When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me." Eleanor laughed, giddy and overwhelmed. "That's not much of a proposal." "You're right, let me try again." James slid off the bench and onto one knee, still holding her left hand. "Eleanor Brennan, you are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You've brought light into my life and joy into this house. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life watching you be yourself, loving you with everything I have. Will you marry me?" Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, happy tears this time. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." James stood and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around on the porch while she laughed and cried and held onto him. When he set her down, he kissed her again, and then again, like he couldn't get enough, and Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor. "We should do this properly," James said when they finally came up for air. "Court you right, wait a respectable time. How long were you thinking?" Eleanor was still in his arms, not willing to let go. 3 months until Christmas," James grinned. "Or is that too soon?" "That's perfect." Eleanor stood on her toes to kiss him again. "But I don't need courting, James. I already know you. I already love you. Humor me. I want to do this right, give you the romance you deserve." James tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Starting with this." He lifted her left hand to his lips and kissed it, a deliberate, reverent gesture that took Eleanor's breath away. It was exactly what she'd needed without knowing she needed it. This man she loved, honoring the part of her that her father had despised, showing her that it was worthy of affection and respect. "My father said I was cursed because I'm left-handed," Eleanor said softly, echoing words she'd spoken to James that first day at her father's grave, words she'd carried like weights her whole life. "Then let me be the one to break that curse," James replied, kissing her hand again. "This hand isn't cursed, Eleanor. It's beautiful. You're beautiful, all of you." Eleanor pulled him into another kiss, this one slower, sweeter, full of promise. When they finally went inside for the night, retiring to their separate rooms because James insisted on propriety, Eleanor lay in bed touching her lips where he'd kissed her, looking at her left hand in the moonlight streaming through the window. For the first time in her life, she looked at that hand and felt only gratitude. This hand had thrown a knife to save them. This hand had gentled thunder. This hand had written the ranch accounts and cooked meals and done 1,000 small tasks well. And now this hand bore the kiss of a good man who loved her. Maybe her father had been right about one thing. Maybe she was cursed. But if she was, it was the best kind of curse, the kind that brought her across half of Texas to find the place where she belonged, the person she belonged with. The next 3 months were the happiest of Eleanor's life. James courted her with an old-fashioned sweetness that made her heart melt. Bringing her wildflowers he picked on his rides, reading to her in the evenings from books he ordered from a catalog, teaching her to dance in the kitchen to music only they could hear. They kept their physical affection chaste, nothing more than kisses and hand-holding, but the restraint only built the tension between them, the anticipation of their wedding night a constant undercurrent. Word spread through Silver Springs about their engagement, and the town embraced Eleanor fully, women stopping by with recipes and advice, men congratulating James on his good fortune. Reverend Matthews, the traveling preacher, agreed to perform the ceremony when he came through in December, and Mrs. Johnson insisted on hosting a celebration at the Mercantile after the wedding. Eleanor wrote a letter to the few people she'd known in Dry Creek, letting them know she was well and getting married, and she received one reply from the doctor, old Samuel Pritchard, who wrote that he was happy for her and sorry he hadn't done more to help her when she was growing up. She forgave him in her heart and tucked the letter away, grateful but not needing it. Her life was here now, her future bright with possibility. As Christmas approached, James became increasingly nervous, fussing over details and worrying that everything would go wrong. Eleanor found his anxiety endearing and did her best to calm him. "It's just a wedding," she said one evening as he paced the kitchen, fretting about whether they'd ordered enough food. "It's not just a wedding. It's your wedding, our wedding. It should be perfect. James ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up in ways that Eleanor found adorable. It will be perfect because we'll be together. Eleanor caught his hand, pulling him to a stop. Nothing else matters, James, just you and me and the life we're building. James pulled her close, kissing her forehead. How did I get so lucky? I think luck had nothing to do with it. I think this was always supposed to happen somehow. Eleanor leaned into his warmth. Every bad thing that happened in Dry Creek led me to that cemetery the day you came. Every time my father told me I was cursed, it made me stronger, made me the person who could appreciate what you're offering. Maybe that's the point of hard times, to prepare us for the good ones. You're a philosopher now, James teased gently. I'm just a woman in love. Eleanor tilted her face up for a kiss, and James obliged, his lips soft and sure against hers. The wedding day dawned cold and clear, the December sky a brilliant blue. Eleanor wore a new dress that Mrs. Johnson had helped her make, a simple cream-colored gown with lace at the collar and cuffs. She styled her hair in a loose updo, letting a few curls frame her face, and she wore her mother's ring on her right hand, saving her left for the wedding band James would give her. The ceremony was held in the small church, packed with what seemed like the entire population of Silver Springs. James stood at the altar in his best suit, his hair slicked back, his eyes locked on Eleanor from the moment she entered. She walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, and she was glad. This choice was hers, this life was hers, earned with courage and hope. Reverend Matthews performed a simple ceremony, speaking about love and commitment and the grace of God. When it came time for the vows, James took both of Eleanor's hands, left and right, and spoke clearly. I, James Cordell, take you, Eleanor Brennan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you in sickness and health, in prosperity and hardship, for as long as we both live. I promise to honor every part of you, to treat you as my equal partner, and to build a life with you that's worthy of your courage and grace. Eleanor's voice shook slightly as she repeated the vows, but she held James's gaze, pouring every ounce of her love into the words. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. The celebration at the Mercantile was loud and joyful, full of music and dancing and food. Eleanor danced with James, with Sheriff Brady, with the blacksmith and the doctor and half the men in town. She talked with the women, accepting their congratulations and advice, feeling surrounded by community in a way she'd never experienced. When the sun began to set, James whispered in her ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Cordell?" The name sent a thrill through her. More than ready. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, Eleanor tucked against James's side, both of them too full of emotion for much talking. When they reached the house, James carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests and set her down gently in the main room. "Welcome home, wife," he said, his voice husky. "It's good to be here, husband." Eleanor reached up to cup his face, this beloved face she'd come to know so well. I love you too, so much." James kissed her, and the kiss deepened, became something more urgent. "Eleanor, I've been waiting for this moment since the day I met you. Tell me if I'm going too fast, if you need me to slow down." "Don't slow down," Eleanor whispered against his lips. "I've been waiting too." James swept her up in his arms again and carried her to his bedroom, which was now their bedroom, and laid her gently on the bed. What followed was tender and passionate, sometimes awkward because they were both learning, but ultimately perfect because it was them together, finally free to express the love that had been building for months. Later, lying in James's arms with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, Eleanor felt a peace settle over her that was almost overwhelming. This was home. This was love. This was the life she'd always dreamed of but never believed she could have. "What are you thinking?" James asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm grateful. For you, for this, for everything." Eleanor tilted her head to look up at him. "My father spent my whole life trying to make me believe I was cursed." But if I was, then the curse led me straight to you, and I can't regret that. You were never cursed, love. You were just waiting for the right person to see you clearly." James kissed the top of her head. "And I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." They fell asleep tangled together, and Eleanor's last conscious thought was that she'd finally found where she belonged. The years that followed were full and rich. Eleanor threw herself into ranch life, becoming as skilled as James at managing the cattle and horses. They expanded the herd, bought more land, built a second barn. The ranch prospered under their joint leadership, and they became known throughout the territory as fair employers and honest dealers. In the spring of 1880, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She'd been feeling ill for weeks, exhausted and queasy, and when Doc Patterson confirmed her suspicions, she rode home to tell James with her heart full of joy and terror. She found him in the corral, working with a young colt, and when he saw her face, he immediately stopped what he was doing and came to her. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" "I'm pregnant," Eleanor blurted out and watched James's face transform from concern to pure elation. "Really? You're sure?" He picked her up and spun her around, much as he had the night he proposed, and Eleanor laughed despite her nerves. "The doctor is sure. I'm about 3 months along. The baby will come in October." Eleanor cupped James's face. "Are you happy?" "Happy, Eleanor, I'm over the moon. We're going to be parents." James set her down carefully, suddenly treating her like she was made of glass. "You need to rest. You shouldn't be doing heavy work. I'll hire more help." Eleanor rolled her eyes fondly. "I'm pregnant, not dying. I can still work, at least for a while." "But yes, maybe some extra help wouldn't be bad." James was wonderfully, ridiculously overprotective for the entire pregnancy, constantly worrying and fussing, but Eleanor found she didn't mind. It was such a stark contrast to how her father had treated her mother during her pregnancy with Eleanor, with indifference and irritation. James's love and care felt like a balm on old wounds. Their son was born on October 15th, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the lamps flicker. Doc Patterson attended the birth, along with Mrs. Johnson and 2 other women from town, and James paced the main room, wearing a path in the floorboards with his worry. When Eleanor's cries finally gave way to the lusty wail of a newborn, James burst into the bedroom, ignoring Doc Patterson's protests about propriety. He found Eleanor exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "We have a son," she said, tears streaming down her face. "James, we have a boy." James approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at the tiny face of his son, all red and wrinkled and perfect. "He's beautiful. You're beautiful. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas, after James's brother, with the middle name Marcus, after Eleanor's father. It felt right to honor both men, to remember them in the creation of this new life. When Eleanor suggested the name Marcus, James looked at her with concern. "Are you sure? After everything he did?" "He was still my father. And maybe if he'd had more love in his life, more acceptance, he wouldn't have been so afraid. I want to remember that fear and cruelty come from pain, and to make sure our son never knows that kind of pain." Eleanor looked down at baby Thomas, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Besides, it's just a name. He'll be his own person." Baby Thomas was indeed his own person from the start, loud, demanding, and full of personality. He kept them up at all hours, and Eleanor spent the first months in a fog of exhaustion, but she'd never been happier. Watching James with their son, seeing the tenderness with which he handled the tiny body, the wonder in his eyes as he counted fingers and toes, made Eleanor fall in love with her husband all over again. When Thomas was 6 months old, Eleanor noticed that he reached for things with his left hand more often than his right. Her heart clenched with old fear, but when she mentioned it to James, he just smiled. Then he'll have his mother to teach him. And no one will tell him he's cursed, not while I'm alive to prevent it. James took her left hand and kissed it, the gesture that had become their private ritual. "Our son is perfect, Eleanor, just like you." Thomas grew into a bright, active toddler, and the house rang with his laughter and chatter. He was, indeed, left-handed, and Eleanor taught him to write and draw and do all the small tasks of daily life without shame or apology. She told him stories about how being left-handed made him special, gave him unique strengths, and Thomas believed her because he'd never known anything different. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again, and in the spring of 1884 they welcomed a daughter they named Rose Marie. Rose was quieter than Thomas had been, more contemplative, and she was right-handed, which secretly relieved Eleanor even though she knew it shouldn't matter. The ranch continued to thrive, and James and Eleanor became pillars of the Silver Springs community. They hosted gatherings at the ranch, helped neighbors in times of trouble, and raised their children with love and respect. Eleanor never forgot where she'd come from, never forgot the girl who'd been told she was cursed, and she made it her mission to teach both her children that differences were to be celebrated, not feared. In the summer of 1886, a traveling group of entertainers came through Silver Springs, including a knife thrower who performed in the saloon. Thomas, now 7, was fascinated, and he begged Eleanor to take him to see the show. Eleanor was reluctant, worried about exposing her son to saloon life, but James convinced her it would be fine. The knife thrower was impressive, hitting targets blindfolded, throwing multiple knives at once, and the crowd was enthralled. After the show, Thomas dragged Eleanor over to meet the performer, a woman named Sarah who had tattoos up and down her arms and a smile that was all confidence. "Your mother throws knives too," James said, ruffling Thomas's hair. "Better than anyone I've ever seen." Sarah looked at Eleanor with interest. "Is that so?" Eleanor felt suddenly shy, all the old fears rushing back. "I used to, not professionally or anything, just for protection." "Show me." Sarah pulled out a knife and gestured to a wooden post outside the saloon. "If you want to, of course." Eleanor looked at the knife, then at James, who nodded encouragingly. Thomas was bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Please, Ma, show us." Eleanor took the knife in her left hand, feeling the familiar weight of it, the balance. She hadn't thrown in years, not since that day in the canyon. She sighted down the post, took a breath, and threw. The knife buried itself dead center in the post with a solid thunk. The small crowd that had gathered burst into applause, and Thomas shrieked with delight. "My Ma is amazing." Sarah retrieved the knife, examining the throw with a professional eye. "That's exceptional form, and you're left-handed, which is rare. Ever think about performing?" Eleanor laughed. "No, thank you, I'm happy where I am, but it's nice to know I haven't lost my touch." On the ride home, Thomas peppered her with questions about knife throwing, about how she learned, about whether she'd teach him. Eleanor promised she would when he was older, and she caught James smiling at her from across the wagon. "What?" she asked, "just thinking about how far you've come." From the girl who was afraid to use her left hand in public to throwing knives in front of a crowd and not even blinking. James reached over to squeeze her hand, left, always left. "I'm proud of you." "I had a good teacher in courage," Eleanor said softly. "You showed me what it looked like to live without shame." That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor and James sat on the porch as they had so many times over the years, watching the stars come out over the mountains. Eleanor leaned against James's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Coming to Dry Creek that day, taking a chance on someone you didn't know?" "Not for a single second." James's voice was firm. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor. You and our children and this life we've built. If I could go back and do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing." "Not even the bandits," Eleanor teased, "especially not the bandits. That's when I knew you were extraordinary." James kissed her temple. "My brave, beautiful, left-handed wife." The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas became a skilled ranch hand, working alongside his father and learning everything James could teach him. He was left-handed in everything he did, and he did it all with confidence and joy because he'd never been taught to be ashamed. Rose grew into a lovely girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's gentle nature. She loved books and learning, and Eleanor and James scraped together the money to send her to a boarding school in Santa Fe when she turned 15, giving her opportunities neither of them had had. In 1892, when Thomas was 17 and already courting a girl from town named Hannah, Eleanor realized she was pregnant again. She was 41 years old, and this pregnancy was harder than the previous two, leaving her exhausted and sick. Doc Patterson was concerned, warning her to take it easy, and James was beside himself with worry. "Maybe this is a sign we shouldn't," James said one night, holding Eleanor while she rested in bed. "Maybe we're too old for this." "Maybe," Eleanor admitted. "But this baby is coming whether we're ready or not. We'll manage. We always do." The baby, another boy they named Samuel, after Doc Patterson, who'd been there for every important moment of their lives in Silver Springs, arrived in February 1893 after a long and difficult labor that scared James half to death. Eleanor recovered slowly, but recover she did, and she found that she loved being a mother to a baby again, even with the exhaustion and the chaos. Samuel was right-handed, quiet like Rose had been, and he adored his older siblings. Thomas was endlessly patient with him, carrying him around the ranch and telling him stories, and Rose, home from school on breaks, doted on him shamelessly. The ranch remained prosperous, and James and Eleanor hired more hands to help with the work as they got older. They became grandparents in 1895 when Thomas married Hannah and they had a daughter, and then again in 1897 with the birth of Thomas's son. Rose came home from school and announced she wanted to be a teacher, and with their blessing, she took a position in Santa Fe, coming home to visit several times a year. In the summer of 1900, on a hot July day much like the one when they'd first met 22 years earlier, Eleanor and James sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard while young Samuel, now 7, chased after them. Eleanor's hair was more gray than dark now, and James had lines around his eyes and mouth, but when he smiled at her, she saw the same man who'd kissed her left hand and told her she wasn't cursed. "You remember the first time we sat here?" Eleanor asked, lacing her fingers through his left hand and right hand. "The night you proposed, every detail. You were wearing that blue dress, the one that made your eyes look like emeralds. The sun was setting, and you looked so beautiful I thought my heart would burst." James brought their joined hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "And you said yes, even though I was just a broken-down cowboy with a dream. You were never broken down. You were everything I needed, everything I'd been waiting for without knowing it." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for saving me. You saved yourself, love. I just gave you a place to land." James wrapped his arm around her. "But I'll tell you a secret. You saved me too. After Thomas died, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, punishing myself. Then you came along and gave me a reason to hope again. You gave me everything." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in colors that never got old, listening to the sounds of family and home. Eleanor thought about her father, about the curse he'd believed in so deeply, and she felt a complicated mix of pity and forgiveness. He'd been wrong, so terribly wrong, but his wrongness had set her on the path that led here, to this porch, to this man, to this life. And if that was a curse, she'd bear it gladly. Thomas came up onto the porch, carrying his youngest daughter, a 3-year-old named Eleanor after her grandmother. "Ma, Pa, Hannah wants to know if you're staying for supper." "We'd be honored," James said, standing and offering Eleanor his hand. She took it with her left hand, as she always did, and let him pull her to her feet. Little Eleanor reached out for her grandmother, and Eleanor took the child in her arms, feeling the weight of her, the trust. "You know what?" she said to the little girl. "I'm going to tell you a story about a time when people thought being different was bad. But then, a cowboy came along and showed everyone that different was actually wonderful. Tell me." Little Eleanor demanded, and Eleanor carried her inside, James following close behind. while she began to spin the tale of a girl with a left hand and the man who kissed it first, who saw past fear to truth, and who loved her exactly as she was. And they all lived, as the best stories promise, happily ever after. The ranch continued to thrive for many more years, passed down through Thomas to his children and their children after him. The story of Eleanor and James became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, a reminder that love and acceptance could triumph over fear and prejudice. The house still stands in the foothills outside Silver Springs, with the porch where James proposed and the bedroom where 3 children were born, a testament to the life 2 people built when they dared to see each other clearly and love without conditions. Eleanor lived to be 73, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1909 with James holding her left hand. James followed her 6 months later, unable to bear life without his beloved wife, and they were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking Silver Springs, their headstones marking the resting place of 2 people who had loved deeply and well. On Eleanor's headstone at James's request before he died were carved the words, "Here lies Eleanor Cordell, beloved wife and mother. Her left hand wrought miracles, her heart knew no bounds," and beneath that in smaller letters, "She was never cursed, she was blessed beyond measure." Young Samuel grew up to be a doctor, serving the people of Silver Springs and the surrounding territory with the same compassion and acceptance his parents had shown him. He never married, dedicating his life to healing, but he was happy, surrounded by nieces and nephews and the love of the community his parents had helped build. Rose became a celebrated teacher in Santa Fe, known for her progressive ideas about education and her insistence that all children, regardless of background or physical differences, deserved quality schooling. She married late, at 40, to a fellow teacher, and they had one son who became a lawyer and fought for the rights of those society overlooked. Thomas ran the ranch until he was too old to ride, then turned it over to his eldest son, James II, named for the grandfather he'd adored. The Cordell Ranch became known throughout New Mexico Territory, and beyond for its quality cattle and horses, but more importantly, for the family that ran it with integrity and kindness. The knife that Eleanor had used to save them from the bandits all those years ago was kept in a place of honor in the house, mounted on the wall above the fireplace, a reminder of courage and quick thinking. The story of that day was passed down through generations, growing slightly in the telling but never losing its essential truth. That Eleanor Cordell was a woman of extraordinary bravery who'd refused to be defined by others' fears. In 1925, when little Eleanor, named for her grandmother, was 28 and pregnant with her 3rd child, she wrote a letter to her grandmother's old doctor in Dry Creek, the one who'd attended Marcus Brennan's death and written to wish Eleanor well on her marriage. Samuel Pritchard was 92 by then, but still alive, and he wrote back with a shaky hand to say he remembered Eleanor Brennan well, remembered the fearful girl everyone had scorned, and that he'd often wondered what became of her. Young Eleanor wrote back with the story of her grandmother's life, the escape from Dry Creek, the journey west, the love she'd found with James, the family she'd built, the legacy she'd left. She included a photograph of the family reunion held at the ranch the summer before James died, showing 4 generations of Cordells gathered together, all smiling, all clearly loved. Samuel Pritchard's reply was brief but heartfelt. "Tell anyone who'll listen that I was wrong to stay silent when Eleanor needed someone to speak up for her. Tell them that courage isn't just fighting battles, it's also recognizing when you've been unjust and doing better. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, and I'm grateful to know she found the happiness she deserved." Young Eleanor framed that letter and hung it next to the knife, another piece of family history, another reminder that people could change, could grow, could learn to see past their prejudices to the truth beneath. The years marched on, as years do, and the Wild West became the Old West, and then just history. Silver Springs grew from a tiny settlement to a proper town with paved streets and electricity and automobiles. The ranch adapted with the times, adding modern equipment and techniques, but always maintaining the core values that Eleanor and James had established: hard work, honesty, respect for all people regardless of their differences. On the 100th anniversary of Eleanor and James's wedding, in December 1978, the family held a massive reunion at the ranch. Descendants came from all over the country, some of whom had never been to New Mexico before, all wanting to connect with their roots, to see the place where their ancestor had found freedom and love. James IV, great-great-grandson of the original James and Eleanor, still ran the ranch, and he stood on that same porch where his great-great-grandfather had proposed and welcomed everyone home. He told the story he'd heard from his grandfather, who'd heard it from his father, who'd heard it from Thomas himself, of a cursed girl and a lonely cowboy and the love that transformed them both. "We're here because two people had the courage to see past what society told them was true," James IV said to the gathered family. "Because a man looked at a woman everyone else had rejected and saw someone worthy of love. Because a woman learned to love herself enough to accept that love. That's our heritage. That's what we honor today." They toasted with champagne and sparkling cider, and someone proposed a toast specifically to left-handed family members, of which there were several scattered through the generations. They all raised their glasses, left-handed and right-handed alike, and drank to Eleanor Brennan Cordell, who'd turned a curse into a blessing. Later that evening, as the party wound down, James IV stood on the porch with his own wife, Maria, and their two teenage daughters. The older girl, Sarah, was left-handed, something James IV had celebrated from the moment she'd first reached for a toy with her left hand. "Dad," Sarah said, leaning against the porch railing, "do you think great-great-grandma Eleanor ever really believed she was cursed?" James IV considered the question. "I think for a long time she did, because that's what everyone told her. But then she met great-great-grandpa James and he helped her see the truth. That's what love does, Sarah. It helps us see ourselves the way we really are, not the way others tell us we should be." "I'm glad I'm left-handed," Sarah said softly. "I'm glad I have that connection to her. So am I, Mija." Maria put her arm around her daughter. "You come from a long line of strong women who refuse to be limited by others' fears. That's something to be proud of." The three of them stood together, looking out at the land that Eleanor and James had tamed and loved, and they felt the presence of those who'd come before, the weight of history and love that connected them across time. Inside the house, the party continued, full of laughter and music and the warmth of family. The knife still hung above the fireplace, its blade dulled with age but its story sharp and clear. The photographs of Eleanor and James, young and serious in their wedding portrait, older and smiling in later pictures, watched over the gathering like benevolent spirits. And if you'd been there, if you'd listened closely beneath the chatter and the music, you might have heard an echo of Eleanor's voice telling little Eleanor that story so many years ago, about a girl and a cowboy and a love that conquered fear. About a hand that was never cursed, only waiting for the right person to see its true worth. About starting over and finding home and learning that different isn't wrong, it's just different, and different is beautiful. The story of Eleanor and James Cordell became more than just family history. It became a parable told in Silver Springs, a reminder to each new generation that judging people by arbitrary standards leads only to pain and loss, while acceptance and love lead to joy and growth. The local historical society included their story in the town museum, displaying Eleanor's knife and copies of letters and photographs, telling visitors about the woman who'd been called cursed and the man who'd helped her find her power. School children in Silver Springs learned about Eleanor Cordell in their history lessons, about how she'd challenged the superstitions of her time and built a legacy of acceptance. Teachers used her story to talk about prejudice and courage, about the importance of questioning what society tells you is true, about the power of one person's love to change another person's life. And every year, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, someone from the family would visit her grave and place wildflowers on it, the kind James used to pick for her during their courtship. They would stand in silence for a moment, honoring her memory, remembering her courage, grateful for the life she'd lived and the family she'd created. The ranch still operates today in the 21st century, run by the 7th generation of Cordells. It's been modernized, of course, with computers and solar panels and modern livestock management techniques. But the original house still stands, preserved as a link to the past. Tourists can visit by appointment, walking through the rooms where Eleanor cooked and cleaned and raised her children, standing on the porch where James proposed, seeing the knife above the fireplace and the photographs on the walls. And every guide who shows visitors through the house tells the same story, the one passed down through generations, polished smooth by repetition but never losing its essential truth. Once upon a time in the Wild West of 1878, there was a girl named Eleanor who was told she was cursed because she was left-handed. Her father believed it, the town believed it, and for a long time she believed it too. But then a cowboy named James Cordell came to her father's funeral and offered her a chance at a new life. On the journey west, she saved his life with that very left hand everyone had feared, throwing a knife with deadly accuracy to stop bandits who would have killed them both. And when she told him what her father had said about being cursed, about her left hand being evil, James took that hand in his and kissed it, honoring the very thing others had reviled. That simple gesture changed everything. It showed Eleanor that she'd never been cursed, that her difference was a gift, that she was worthy of love exactly as she was. They built a life together, the cursed girl and the lonely cowboy. They had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they filled the house with love and laughter. They showed everyone around them that acceptance was stronger than fear, that love could triumph over prejudice, that one person's courage to be themselves could inspire generations. Eleanor Brennan Cordell wasn't cursed. She was blessed with extraordinary courage, with a left hand that saved lives and gentled horses, and wrote the story of her family in neat script in ledger books that are now preserved in the museum. She was blessed with a man who loved her unconditionally, who saw her clearly and cherished what he saw. She was blessed with a long life, with children who adored her, with the chance to prove everyone who doubted her completely and utterly wrong. And that blessing continues today in every left-handed child who grows up hearing the story of Eleanor Cordell and learning that they're special, not cursed. In every person who faces prejudice and finds the courage to stand tall anyway. In every act of love that sees past surface differences to the essential humanity beneath. The Wild West is gone, vanished into history books and legend. But the love story of Eleanor and James Cordell remains, as vivid and powerful as the day it began in a dusty cemetery in Dry Creek, Texas. It remains in the land they shaped, in the family they created, in the legacy of acceptance and courage they left behind. And it remains in the simple, profound truth that sometimes what the world calls a curse is actually the greatest blessing of all, if only you have the courage to claim it, and someone beside you brave enough to kiss your hand first.